Hi there everyone, and welcome to the Novel Strip Show, where I discuss books and comics. What I'd like to do today is part one of my October 2018 wrap-up. So in October 2018, I've managed to finish two series, the Strange the Dreamer duology and the Demon Cycle quintology. So what I'll do is start with Strange the Dreamer. So the first book in the series is called Strange the Dreamer. The second book, which is the last book, is called Muse of Nightmares. So for a brief synopsis, we follow Laszlo Strange, who's an orphan raised by monks. He's incredibly imaginative and always dreaming, hence his nickname, Strange the Dreamer. And his favourite stories are about one city in particular. However, one day he finds that neither he nor anyone else can remember its proper name. Every time they try to say the city's name, all that comes out is weep. So I'll stop there. I could go a lot more into the plot, but I went into this book knowing very, very little about the plot, I'd listened to a few brief summaries, but by the time I actually got to reading it, I'd forgotten kind of even the brief synopsis that I've just given there, and I really think it's beneficial to go into the book knowing as little as possible. So what I'll do is I will make this my non-spoiler review. I imagine it'll be fairly long, so I'll probably do another video where I have more spoilers in it, but yeah, this is completely non-spoiler. So what I want to do is start with just talking about my journey to acquiring this book, because it was, quite epic, to be honest. So it all started when I first saw Kitty G's video where she talks about the book. I'll pop the link hopefully in a card and in the description so you can check that out. And the plot sounded intriguing, but what caught my eye most was her copy. She had the paperback copy, which has a dark blue cover, light blue edges, and a gold moth on the front. And I honestly thought this was one of the most beautiful books that I'd ever seen. I wanted it. So I began looking online, it was really, really difficult to find that cover, especially with blue sprayed edges. So I went all around Edinburgh looking for it. I looked in London when I was back. I emailed various different bookshops to see if they had a copy, and I just couldn't find it anywhere. So this went on for at least a year. And then a copy appeared on eBay, and I was really excited. It was the one with blue sprayed edges and everything, but in the end it sold for £50. So I was outbid, and I decided that I couldn't really, justify £50 on a book, considering I very, very, very rarely spend more than £3 on a book. However, a few months later, issues started appearing for about £250. Now I think the most expensive issue I've seen is up for, or has sold for, about £400, because they are quite hard to come by now. It was just the first printing of the first edition that had blue stained edges, and so now when you do find them, they're incredibly expensive. So the fact that I didn't get it when it was £50, I'm absolutely gutted, to be honest. But never mind, I kept looking, and eventually I found the correct cover, the blue cover with the gold moth, and although it didn't have the blue stained edges, it was signed by Laini Taylor inside. So it was £20 plus £3.99 postage, that was the book that I got, and I did an unboxing of it, so I'll link that in the card as well if you'd like to check that out, and see just, how beautiful it is. Very pleased I got it then, because the seller was really nice. It came wrapped in bubble wrap, he let me know that he would have copies of the second book in on the release date, and he could send me one, etc. I'd already pre-ordered it, but still I thought it was excellent service. He does only have a few copies left though, so he has upped the price to £35 because they are so hard to come by now. So I'm definitely glad I got it when I did. I will have a proper link to this eBay seller in the description though, in case you would like to buy a copy with this cover. I've also ordered, which is very exciting, some exclusive special editions with gold edges for Strange the Dreamer and silver edges for Muse of Nightmares. So that's from Illumicrate. I'll put a link to that down as well. They're even more limited than the first print run was. So yeah, hopefully I'll do an unboxing of those when I get them. Please watch out for that as well. So basically it was a real journey to get my hands on this edition of the book, but from the first moment I saw it, there was something about it looked so beautiful, especially with the contrast in light blue pages against the dark blue cover, and the way, you know, the gold reflected off it. They're two of my favorite colors, blue and gold, especially when they're combined, and it's kind of got deep purples on the front as well, and I love that color scheme, and it it was just something that I craved. I sought after it. I went on journeys to find it, to find any way of trying to find it, and basically that's exactly what happens with Strange and this lost city. He's obsessed with it. He keeps searching for it. He does everything he can to research it, etc. So I immediately made a connection with him there. Another thing is that Strange is always dreaming, so that's something else that I can really identify with. As a young child, you know, I was constantly imagining things. I'm an only child, but it never really bothered me too much, because although I didn't have anyone else there to play with physically, that just made me even more imaginative, and I could imagine, you know, hundreds of people, you know, wizards and dragons and whatever around me, he's very much like that. So when we get to see him as a child, it was almost like in part reading about myself, because as well as dreaming, it turns out that when he arrives at the monastery, when he's first born, he's completely grey. So I won't say the reason for that, you don't find out until the end. But yeah, it's a much more interesting reason than being asphyxiated by your umbilical cord as I was. Either way, though, that kind of, it just made me feel an instant connection with him, because there were so many parallels, especially the being born grey thing. That's kind of a weird parallel. And it just made me think, you know, if you believe in destiny or whatever, it just made me think I was destined to, you know, read this book and have it be a part of my life. And I was, initially drawn in by Strange. I do wonder if that's maybe kind of clouded my judgment a little bit. I mean, I love the fantasy element of the plot, and I could see very clear parallels between myself and the main character, because I did really, really enjoy the book. But I think that enjoyment was very personal to me, so I don't know that it's a book that I would recommend to everyone. For example, with Purple Hibiscus or Great Expectations, to name just two, I truly believe anyone could read that book, and despite the plot, despite it, you know, it might not be to their personal taste or anything like that, I still think they would kind of have to concede that they're well-written books. I think everyone would get something out of them. I think everyone would get something out of this book as well, but I do think my kind of strong love for it is quite personal, so I would probably end up only recommending it to people who sort of like fantasy and YA initially. In terms of people calling it YA, when I was reading Strange the Dreamer, so the first book, I kind of struggled to call it YA. I debated whether it should be regarded as that or not, because I don't believe just having characters who are on the cusp of becoming adults, sort of 16, 17, 18, to me that doesn't solely make a book part of the sort of YA genre that seems to have emerged in the past few years. I mean, I do think, having read the second book, there were more elements that were typical of YA books, especially YA fantasy. I wonder if it's I'm kind of torn between not wanting to class it as YA, because I think it's of a far higher quality than other YA books that I've read. But at the same time, I do think that the reason I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone is because there are a few things lacking from it, and I think what's lacking is symptomatic of it being a YA book, and it just kind of hovers on the cusp there of young adult into adult, and I think that's what kind of lets it down a little bit, or for me to say why it's not going to be a classic, for example, that I would recommend to anyone. But yeah, to go into a bit more detail, again, just keeping it spoiler free, I'll talk about what I did really like. So firstly, the writing style is beautiful. It took me a little while to kind of get into it, and to kind of grasp where it was going, and that's part of the reason why I normally kind of anyone can read it really easily. It's just very simplistic and you get straight into it. Whereas with Stranger Dream, I found it took about 100 pages, but then once those 100 pages were over, it kind of clicked, and I just whizzed through the rest and read it very, very quickly. And the same with the second book as well. But yeah, the writing's incredibly beautiful without being in any way pretentious. So it's incredibly visual throughout, and colours are mentioned a lot. And it's interesting to know that Laini Taylor, the author, is actually an artist as well. And I think you can very much see that in her writing, because everything is so easy to visualise, and the colours that are mentioned very much, contrast with one another. You can build up a colour scheme in your head. So I think her artistic influence is very prevalent throughout the book. But just to give an example of what's so beautiful is, for example, one of the characters is described throughout as having cinnamon hair. So instead of saying reddish brown or anything like that, or making a sort of ridiculous, trite, stupid simile like might have been done if this was written by the author of The Book Thief, and saying her hair was like reddish brown, like, I don't know, dried blood or something. I really didn't like that book. She chose the word cinnamon, and yeah, so to me it kind of I really like that, because I can imagine the colour of her hair as the colour of cinnamon, but also it evokes my other senses as well. That makes me think of the smell of cinnamon. It makes me think of something very spicy and exotic, and it appeals to my other senses rather than just the visual one. So yeah, there are things like this. Obviously, that's a very simplistic one, but there are things like that in terms of the language that's used all throughout, and it doesn't at any point seem excessive or too flowery or too pretentious. It's just nice. So again, in terms of the world building, so there's a fair amount of attention to detail. As I said, I find it very easy to visually picture everything. And everything's quite simple. There's, you're not bombarded with loads and loads of detail. But you're given just enough to be able to picture everything very, very vividly. And yeah, there are little things like, for example, made up alphabets, and people's sort of names, like mountains, rivers, and geographical locations and towns and things. They're all given names. They're all named. So it just makes you feel a bit more part of the world, rather than just saying they went to the desert or something like that. So that was, appreciated. In terms of the characters, I think they're definitely, well developed. They're mostly quite interesting, and they're all slightly dubious in terms of their morality. They kind of, a lot of them seem to go through journeys, and at the start you kind of end up hating some, and then by the end you love them, and vice versa. So yeah, once I got into the book, I really couldn't put it down. I read both books very, very quickly. They're probably the quickest that I've got through books, certainly the quickest that I've got through an entire series, because they're both, over 500 pages each, so they're not short books, and they're big, oversized paperbacks as well. So if you got the oversized hardbacks, if you got the paperback, it would be even longer, I imagine. So yeah, they're not short, but I could read them really quickly, because I genuinely was compelled throughout to find out what was going to happen, and I just couldn't put them down. In terms of the themes of the plot and everything, I needed to know what happened to the characters. And yeah, what I really liked as well going into the second book is that, so the first finishes on a massive cliffhanger, and then going into the second book, it starts with two completely new characters, and I actually really liked that, that it kept you waiting even longer. So yeah, in terms of kind of the downsides, I think it's perhaps not the most original of books. I think it definitely draws influence from other YA fantasy series and other can't speak, other fantasy series in general. But I think there's enough originality to keep you interested throughout the series. And yeah, with the second book there, just kind of in terms of the other things that sort of annoyed me a little bit more. I appreciate for most people. So the first book came out in March 2017. It wasn't until this month, so October 2018, that the second book came out. So that's 18 months or so with a gap there. If I'd been waiting that long, I might have appreciated some repetition or refreshing in the second book, but obviously I went straight from one to the other, so there was a bit of repetition in it, and even some things that were mentioned at the start of the second book were then repeated later on in the second book. So some of it did feel slightly unnecessary, and I do feel as though the second book especially could maybe have been slightly better edited, or maybe if she's taken even just slightly longer to get it up to the same standard as the first one, because there were some elements where I just felt that there was needless repetition. And yeah, I really did like it, and I think if you regard it as a YA book, then it's probably the best YA I've read. I think I'd maybe only rate Harry Potter above it in terms of how much I enjoyed it and how wide an audience I think it will appeal to. But I do think everything was just a hair off, just so slightly off. So in terms of the writing style, I just wanted it ever so slightly more complex. In terms of the world, I just wanted it ever so slightly more fleshed out. In terms of the characters, I wanted ever so slightly more background information. And I feel as though without that, I was very able to visualize everything, but I didn't quite get to the point of feeling as though I was part of that world and completely immersed in it in every single way. It was very much like watching a film or a TV series. Everything was very visual, but there wasn't much to give me a kind of visceral reaction as if I were 100% part of the world. And I just feel as though if those things had been tweaked and added to just slightly, it would have pushed it from the cusp of young adult into adult, and made me feel as though, I was fully part of that world, and then would kind of recommend it to everyone. I think that's probably, what's holding me back. Overall, though, like, I definitely, if you enjoy YA, and maybe go into it expecting a YA book, then I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised. Even people who don't like YA, I mean, normally I absolutely hate it. There's very few YA series that I like, but I really enjoyed this book. And I would definitely recommend people read it, because for no other reason, I really need people to discuss it with. Thanks very much for watching. And once you've read it, please keep a lookout for my spoiler reviews. I'm going to start off with moderate spoilers, so if you do just want a bit more information before you go into the book, I wouldn't recommend it, but there won't be any major spoilers. And then when I do go on to major spoilers, I'll make an announcement so you can stop watching then. If you have read the book, or when you've read the book, please do go and watch it. And as always, thanks for listening.